I told my wife Emily that my seminar finished a day early, but I couldn't change my flight, so I'd be back on Tuesday night. She was supposed to pick me up at the airport around 6 o'clock. She expressed some frustration about me being away for another night, but said she would be delighted to see me after. After thinking for an hour, I realized I had been away from home a lot. I decided to prioritize my wife, with whom I've lived for 17 years. I went to the airport, almost gave up, but then noticed a flight to an airport near our hometown leaving in half an hour. I bought a ticket, and an hour later, I was in the air. 3 hours later, I landed, rented a car, and expected to be home around midnight. Emily had to find a way to express her joy at my early return. Just before midnight, I arrived home to a dark house, and Emily's car was gone. Puzzled, I called her, and she answered, saying she had been asleep, planning to pick me up at 6 in the morning. Curious, I inquired about her being asleep, but not at home. She explained the phone didn't work and mentioned a repair scheduled for the next day. I informed her I wouldn't be on the 6 o'clock flight and would stay a few more days. She expressed longing for me and asked me to come home as soon as I could. As I finished the call, I noticed a hint of laughter in her voice. I dialed our home phone and it rang normally. I went up to our room, searched for Emily, but she was nowhere to be found. I realized something was off. The next morning, I moved the rental car and saw Emily's car pull up with a man driving. I hid and they entered. Emily mentioned getting ready for work, and they exchanged suggestive remarks. Her boss, Mr. Boss, suggested she spend the night with him, going out for dinner and returning by 8 o'clock p.m. I overheard plans about a lodge tour and arranging a pickup at the airport. Emily even made a comment suggesting she might offer the man a beer and apologized for any inconvenience. Shocked and hurt, I started planning my next steps. In the midst of their conversation, I learned her boss was transferred from the company headquarters in Houston, which Emily had mentioned before. To find out his name, I discreetly asked the female receptionist at Emily's workplace. She provided me with the needed information. His name was Jeffrey Ross, and he had a wife and 2 teenage children. His wife would stay in Texas until their kids finished school, and then they would join Jeffrey in Springfield. He searched for a house every night after work. I looked up the last name Ross in Houston and found 3 Jeff Rosses. The first call was successful. I asked if she was Mrs. Jeffrey Ross, and she affirmed. Pretending to be Dawn Watson from Halifax, I mentioned planning a surprise party for her husband Jeff. She responded positively, and I provided flight details, explaining that the company would reimburse him. She promised to keep it a secret. Next, I called Emily's friends and family to invite them to the surprise party, using the excuse of her promotion. Everyone was pleased, and I asked them to arrive at our house by 7 o'clock p.m. I contacted a restaurant, ordered food and drinks, and specified the setup on the veranda by the pool. On the day of the plan, I arrived at the airport early. As passengers headed to the baggage area, I approached unaccompanied women, asking if they were Mrs. Ross. Mrs. Ross approached me, looking like a movie star. I introduced myself as Ron and explained that my wife worked for her husband, trying to ease her suspicion. We collected her luggage and headed home, arriving at 6:30. I explained it was an outdoor party for her husband and a celebration for my wife's birthday. By 7:30, all the invited guests were in place. I asked them to park behind the church, and I planned to hide in the living room. When the guest of honor arrived, I would turn off the patio lights as a signal for everyone to be quiet. As 8 o'clock approached, I noticed Emily's car pulling up in front of the house. I switched off the lights on the deck and hid behind the curtains to create a quiet atmosphere. The door opened, and I heard Emily and Jeff laughing, finding it reassuring that they were having a good time. In a lighthearted manner, Jeff expressed eagerness for some private time, and they began their liaison after Emily playfully took off her thong. Carefully, I turned on the light, surprising Emily. She demanded an explanation for my presence. I calmly reminded her that it was my house, and my name was on the deed. Jeff mumbled about needing to leave, and I'd offered him a drink, surprising both of them. I observed Jeff's thought process, recalling Emily's earlier assumption that I would offer him a beer if I caught them. Before Jeff could respond, Emily's wife burst into the room from the veranda, waving a large purse. His surprise left him defenseless, and Emily's mother and sister joined the scene. Emily received a scolding from her mother and was instructed to get dressed. I turned on the porch light, revealing 20 other people looking at her. I grabbed some food and a beer, returning to my seat. The situation was frustrating, but I realized I wasn't responsible for the mess Emily and Jeff had created. As time passed, the situation settled down. Emily's cousin took Mrs. Ross to the motel, while another cousin assisted Jeff to the car. Emily's mother expressed understanding of my likely upset, but believed Emily was already suffering enough. They departed and Emily hid in the bathroom. After cleaning up, I sat down with the last beer of the evening, able to relax. Emily entered the room, and I asked her if she was happy and if that's what she wanted. We discussed the incident when I got caught with my boss, and she expressed frustration in me for not coming to her with problems. I grinned and asked if we had a problem. She claimed I hadn't paid enough attention to her, making her vulnerable to Jeff's advances. I couldn't help but laugh as she tried to blame me for her actions. As I closed the bedroom door behind me and locked it, a profound satisfaction washed over me. My chains had been broken. I found emotional liberation and was on the brink of legal freedom. Anticipating my new life with eagerness, I decided to share another exciting story. Instead of being at work, I was surprisingly calm, enjoying a cup of freshly brewed coffee at the kitchen table. This routine used to be a regular and soothing hobby when our kids were young. I'm Evan Johnson, happily married for 25 years, or at least I was until a couple of hours ago. With 4 children, the last one moved out last year, and my wife seemed to be struggling with empty nest syndrome. Encouraging her to find a hobby, I had no idea it would lead to what happened a short while ago. While brewing my favorite coffee, the aroma didn't interrupt their activities. My wife Audrey kept calling her partner Stallion, urging him on with phrases like "Do it, Stallion," and "Come on, baby, I know you can do it." Audrey was so preoccupied that she hadn't noticed the coffee aroma or my presence. Their explicit words exchanged, with Audrey asking him to tell her how much better he was than her husband, made me consider engaging the safety on my weapon. Her boyfriend, a cop, was in my living room, evidenced by his uniform and gear belt scattered on the floor along with my wife's clothes. Amidst their passionate exchange, I overheard Audrey expressing a desire for increased frequency, stating, "Damn it, baby, we need to find a way to meet 2 or 3 times a week instead of just occasionally." This nightmare was unfolding in my own home, and I wondered how I ended up in the middle of it. It was truly foolish. I went to work and left my briefcase behind. Well, to be precise, I left it in the garage because I had put it there while rescuing our cat, Tabby, from under the hood of my car. Tabby was our second cat, and many years ago, I tragically lost our first cat, Clarence, when I forgot to tap on the hood before starting the car on a cold winter morning. The memory of the sound a cat makes caught in a fan belt spinning at 1,000 revolutions per minute haunted me. My briefcase wasn't that important, so I considered leaving it behind. However, I had to visit a client who drove me straight to my house. As I turned onto my street, I noticed a black and white police car parked out front, causing my heart to sink. Fearing something terrible had happened to my wife, I rushed into the house, not even closing the door. Inside, I discovered an unexpected and disheartening scene. My wife's lover and her passionate screams were disturbing. The verbal humiliation she directed at me was worse, but I needed to witness it to gather necessary evidence. Their activities in my marital bed were unpleasant, and the most shocking part was hearing my wife declare her lover superior to me. As the ordeal continued, it felt like an eternity. After about 90 minutes, it suddenly got very quiet, and I assumed they took a break. I overheard my wife asking about a strange smell, and they began hurriedly cleaning up any evidence of their affair. I made a mental note to get tested for venereal diseases. When they noticed me, Audrey gasped, and her lover, a former police officer named Stad Johnson, seemed dejected. He frantically searched for his missing service arm, also known as his throwing arm, upset that the serial number had been removed. I learned from him that my boss had taken his uniform and patrol car. While they were busy upstairs, I had a nice chat with Stad Johnson. Audrey, upset about the incriminating video, wouldn't be available for a ride home. I sent the email to her, and though her words were hard to comprehend, it seemed to revolve around her father, the chief of police. She questioned how I could do this to our kids, but despite the situation, she shared details about our seemingly nice family. Strangely, I found a sense of enjoyment, feeling like I had a fish on a line, reeling it in. I suggested my wife drive her, but her car had been impounded. Audrey's reaction was a high-pitched squeal upon learning the police impounded her car due to a few ounces of unaccounted-for marijuana. Sergeant Mark mentioned the impoundment was a form of compensation for the troubles caused by the police department, and she could retrieve the car after forensics in a few days. Audrey moaned in a sad tone, similar to a lonely hound howling at the moon. Once the officer left, my wife finally regained her speech, expressing love and claiming it was just a fling. I regretted overreacting and apologized, but she seemed shocked and asked what I did. When I revealed sending the video to our kids, she was aghast, thinking they'd be happy for her. As I nodded, she realized I hadn't mentioned one more thing: her lover's wife working at the same company as us. I assured her I advised not to fire her, and explained my attorney's suggestion for child support, estimating around $3,000 a month. Despite the norm of cheating husbands refusing such arrangements, I expressed my willingness. I planned to take time off for a fishing vacation to cope with my pain, reminiscent of the song Deep Sea Senorita, about fishing in the Gulf of Mexico. The lawyer requested a picture of her, possibly for her father or potential legal matters. I shared the video with her parents and colleagues, not intending to be harsh but wanting everyone to know about her new partner. I noted that her friends on Facebook seemed happy for her at this point. Audrey had almost shut down, sitting on the floor wrapped in her sheets, crying, shaking her head and murmuring, "This can't be happening to me." "All right, dear, it's time to get dressed and prepare your bag. Your parents should arrive soon to pick you up." "Pick me up?" "Well, of course, you'll need a place to stay. The house will have to be sold as part of the divorce," I told her. "Later divorce? You seem to have some questions, dear." "That surprises me. What did you expect would happen when I found out?" "Well, you didn't anticipate getting caught. Should we keep having this pointless conversation for a few minutes?" It was quiet upstairs. She didn't utter a word aside from the occasional sob. "Why is it that cheaters always cry when they get caught? It's a terrible thing. If getting caught is so unpleasant, then please don't cheat in the first place." About 10 minutes later, she came downstairs dressed but without her suitcase. "Evan, honey, we're really..." Then I heard the car of her parents pulling up in front of our house. "Farewell, Audrey. As always, I held the door open for her, being a gentleman." That was a fun story. Now let's move on to another exciting one. Stay tuned and let's dive in. That evening didn't go as expected. The house was eerily quiet, and I couldn't find my wife, Helen, or our kids. Helen and I, Michael Lewis, have been married for 11 years. When I realized the silence, I noticed a note on the table. "Mike, I'm sorry I can't tell you this in person, but I'm too much of a coward to face you. I met someone else and fell in love. The kids are with me and safe. The divorce papers are in the envelope under this note. As you can see, I'm not asking for anything." Helen, naturally, my day and my life, took a nosedive. Within moments, I was pacing around the kitchen, swearing, going through the divorce papers, and finally slumping into a chair. Helen was leaving me the house and all our money, taking only clothes for herself and the kids along with their toys. The most infuriating part was the last demand. Helen wanted me to sign adoption papers for my kids, allowing her new partner to adopt them. It felt like a done deal. At least now I knew who she left me for, Henry Carslake. I decided to call my soon-to-be ex-wife. I greeted her with a curt, "Hey, Helen." She replied with a simple, "Hi, Mike." I proceeded to inquire about her situation, asking, "What's happening?" Helen explained that she had met someone else and fallen in love with him, as she had mentioned in her note. I responded skeptically, expressing my doubts. "Yeah, of course you did. No one just leaves a marriage and sleeps with a guy. I just hope it wasn't in our bed." Helen requested that I refrain from swearing and act civilized. After taking a shower and changing my clothes, I went out to eat since cooking wasn't appealing in my mood. The food was decent, so I decided to head to a bar and have a couple of drinks. After the day I had endured, I felt like I was owed that much. The man Helen left me for was the owner of Carslake Construction Company. I had done some work for this company in the past, but that was about to change. My friend Paul spotted me at the bar and commented on my rare appearance, asking if I had managed to get away from my family for the evening. I replied that it was something like that and explained that I had returned to an empty house with a packet of divorce papers. Paul expressed his surprise upon learning that Helen was divorcing me and commented that he didn't see it coming. I echoed his sentiment, expressing my surprise at the turn of events. I mentioned that she had moved in with Henry Carslake, and Paul was astonished, asking if it was the same Henry of Carslake Construction. I confirmed that it was indeed the same person and shared my suspicion that she was in love with him. Paul inquired about my plans, and I declared that I was going to give her a divorce, since she didn't want anything from me. I explained that there was another form she wanted me to sign, but I had already discarded it. Curious, Paul asked about the nature of that form, and I explained that she wanted me to give the kids to him for adoption, emphasizing that it was not going to happen. Paul shook his head in disgust and made a remark about Carslake, to which I added defiantly that I had been scheduled to start working for him on Monday, but had decided to find another job instead. In the end, I signed the divorce papers despite Helen's attempts to persuade me otherwise, and she eventually gave up. When the divorce was finalized, Chloe was 10 and Lee was 8. I wanted to get back at Karslake, but I didn't want to land in jail for it. I never showed up for work on Monday, and strangely, no one seemed to press me about it. Part of my revenge on Karslake occurred without my involvement. Word got out, and most local contractors refused to work with Karslake Construction. They saw how he had treated me, so they refused his projects. While Henry found other contractors, they were subpar, and the work quality suffered. After 6 months, my divorce became official. 3 months later, Helen and Karslake got married. I took care of the kids for a week while they went on their honeymoon. I didn't do it to help them. I just figured a week was better than the limited time I had on weekends. What bothered me was my daughter, Chloe's question. "Daddy, why did you send us to live with Mom and Henry?" "I didn't send you. Your mother took you because she doesn't love me anymore. If it was up to me, you could have stayed here," I responded, clarifying that it wasn't my choice and that I planned to discuss it with Helen. When Helen arrived to pick up the kids, she seemed tanned and cheerful. I told Helen to stop lying and urged her to tell the kids the truth. I warned her that if she didn't, I would. I mentioned that the kids knew I didn't ask her to take them in, and that I'd fight for custody if I could. Helen walked away in frustration. Life as a single man felt strange after being married for so long. Some friends tried to set me up on dates, but I didn't feel like dating. I wanted love but wasn't in the mood for dating. Little did I know that my life was about to change. My neighbors were Gary and Emily, who had moved in just after Helen left. Their house was a good deal for them, but needed a lot of work. Emily worked as a secretary, and Gary was a retired army man. We got along well, and they seemed like a nice couple. Whenever we crossed paths, we had friendly conversations. Tragedy struck when Gary had a sudden health crisis at work. Paramedics and a doctor arrived quickly, but Gary was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy revealed he had died from a subdural hematoma. Emily was left in distress and alone. I offered her my sympathy, and since her parents were on vacation, I walked her home and poured us drinks. I listened to her as she sobbed and shared her future plans. Emily cried and fell asleep on my couch. I covered her with a blanket and slept in a chair in case she woke up during the night. The next morning, as Emily was leaving, Helen was dropping off the kids. "Good to see you're not wasting any time, Mike," Helen remarked. "Come on, Helen, the poor woman just lost her husband," I replied. Helen glanced at me, then turned to talk to the kids. Later that day, I explained to them why Emily was leaving the house. Chloe seemed sad, and I don't think Lee fully understood. Emily later invited me to attend Gary's funeral, which I did. Thankfully, in the UK, mortgages are insured, so Emily wouldn't be left destitute. This was little comfort given her loss. Emily's parents returned from Europe and spoke to me after the funeral. I assured them that I would look out for Emily, since, apart from my coworkers, I was her only friend. I offered to help with minor household tasks to keep her place in a livable condition. The next time Helen picked up the kids, she remained in the car, which was fine with me since I had no desire to talk to her. Emily and I spent a fair amount of time together, not as a couple, but as friends supporting each other. About a year later, I hadn't seen Emily for a few weeks, partly because I was very busy. My friend Paul was rewiring a house for a young couple and asked me to make an offer on a complete plumbing rewire. My offer was accepted, and I had a busy few weeks getting everything finished. While working on the house with Paul, he kept me up to date with news about Karslake. He still had to use a lot of non-local professionals since most of the local guys refused to work for him. With the work on the house completed, I finally had some time to relax. I decided to take Emily out to dinner. She agreed, and we set a time for Saturday night. When I walked in behind Emily, it took my breath away. She was a petite woman with a pixie cut hairstyle. The dress she wore accentuated her slim figure, and for the first time, I started to feel attracted to her. Dinner went well, and we spent a lot of time discussing our lives. Later that evening, I walked Emily to her door, and she expressed her gratitude for a wonderful evening. I smiled in response, and before I could reply, she surprised me with a passionate kiss that left me breathless. Afterward, she suggested that we go out again to see where things might lead and bid me good night, kissing me on the cheek. This time, we did go out again, and this time it led to us spending the night together. Despite her small stature, Emily was incredibly passionate, and it was a thoroughly satisfying experience. As Emily and I spent more time together, she eventually sold her house and moved in with me. The kids were pleased with my dating life, and it was clear that they would inform Helen, who wasn't thrilled about it. She didn't want me, but Emily did. A year after our first intimate encounter, Emily and I got married. When the kids informed Helen, she simply snorted and turned away. Emily and I went on to have 2 children of our own, Gary and Robert. My older children were now old enough to visit on their own, which reduced my contact with Helen. Years passed, and one day, Chloe announced her engagement. Her boyfriend Josh had proposed the night before. As her father, I offered to help with the wedding expenses. Chloe explained that they initially thought they wouldn't need financial assistance, but Henry had offered to cover the costs with the condition that he would walk her down the aisle. Chloe refused, and Henry withdrew his financial support, leaving her upset. I was frustrated with Carsley for his actions, and Emily suggested using the money from the sale of her house to cover the expenses. I hesitated, considering it was her money, but she insisted and encouraged me to inform Chloe that we would cover the costs. Chloe was overjoyed when I shared the news, and we established a budget that accommodated everything they wanted for the wedding while staying under budget. The following day, Chloe informed me that Henry was furious, and Helen was clearly unhappy. One afternoon, Lee showed up unannounced in our garden, wanting to leave home because he was tired of hearing his mother and Henry argue. Emily asked if they were still arguing about the wedding, but Lee revealed it was something else. He mentioned overhearing their intimate moments and suggested that Henry wasn't performing well in bed. We shared a laugh about the situation, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction that Helen had left me for someone who couldn't fulfill his responsibilities when it mattered. Lee decided to stay the night at our house to avoid any conflicts at home. On Chloe and Josh's wedding day, Helen didn't seem pleased. Chloe told her that she and Henry would sit behind Emily and me during the ceremony. The church service went smoothly. I agreed to have Helen sit at the top table at the reception. Meanwhile, Henry sat with Emily, Robert, Gary, and Lee. After all the speeches, the caterers removed a few tables to make space for dancing. Josh and Chloe led the first dance, and Emily and I joined them, along with Helen and Henry. Later, we found ourselves at the bar, and Gary and Robert were sitting with one of Chloe's bridesmaids and her children. Lee asked Emily if she wanted to dance, and I encouraged him to go for it. Helen took the opportunity to approach me, clearly having had a few drinks, and I had a sense that this encounter might not end well. She began commenting on Emily and me, remarking how young Emily looked and how she hadn't aged despite being the mother of 2 boys. Helen then went on to criticize Emily's appearance, mentioning her weight and attire. I reminded her that we were divorced, and she no longer had the right to comment on my life. Helen continued to make derogatory remarks about Emily, and I defended my wife, telling Helen that Emily was more of a woman than she ever was. I even hinted at my satisfying intimate life with Emily. Helen was left stunned as Henry joined the conversation. I pointed out to Helen that when she left me, she thought she was trading up for something better, and maybe she was or wasn't, but I had moved on. I had my own life, a loving wife, and 4 wonderful children. I walked away, leaving Helen and Henry to their own devices. Emily and I danced to slow music, and as we danced, she asked me about the exchange at the bar. I told her to kiss me, promising to explain later. We shared a kiss, knowing that Helen was watching. After breaking the kiss, I smiled at Helen, who turned away to order another drink. As I looked at Emily, I couldn't help but think that I had indeed traded up for something better in my life.